It may come down to Derek Carr, Chris Olave, and the New Orleans Saints passing game on offense to get back to their winning ways in a shocker on Monday Night Football. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the NFC South still very much up for grabs. A division that can't seem to get out of its own way ends up being good news for the New Orleans Saints. We'll also take a look at the New Orleans Saints defense going up against the Kansas City Chiefs and what it is that they'll have to do to get right, because this is the perfect opportunity to do exactly that. And we'll get started with our kickoff, taking a look at the New Orleans Saints offense, because this game between the New Orleans Saints and Kansas City Chiefs for the Saints may come down to their passing game as opposed to the run game. We got all that and more coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much for being an everyday and for making us your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Saints podcast, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So, it could be the New Orleans Saints passing game that ends up coming in to focus against the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City Chiefs have a really solid, or have been really solid against the run. So the New Orleans Saints will have to figure out a way on Monday night to move the football without it. Look, the Saints right now lead the league in zone rushing attempts over on the offensive side, while the Kansas City Chiefs have been one of the best teams at defending the zone run. And in fact, they've been one of the best teams at defending the man run or gap scheme as well. This has been a big part of what it is that Kansas City has done extremely well as the number 8 kind of top 10 rushing defense in the NFL. I shake at that a little bit just because there's going to be a lot of games played between now and Monday. So we'll see what their ranking ends up being by the time that they actually play the game. But they're likely to stay within the top 10. And then on top of that, you also have, of course, Alvin Kamara's injury status, which didn't really hold him back very much last week in a game where the Saints could have struggled on the ground. Remember, going up against the Philadelphia Eagles countered the New Orleans Saints run game with 5- and 6-man fronts. Well, the Atlanta Falcons tried the same thing. In fact, the Saints faced 5- or 6-man fronts, according to Next Gen Stats, more than any other team in the NFL over the course of those couple of weeks. So the Saints found ways against Atlanta to still be able to run the football and still be able to produce, thanks to Alvin Kamara mostly, right? They were able to do it with Taysom Hill early in the game as well, but then Taysom ended up missing a few quarters with his rib injury. And come to find out, for the New Orleans Saints, those are fractured ribs, right? He's got fractures, according to Dennis Allen. So that's another thing that compounds sort of the complication in the run game, because of all the things that Taysom Hill can do very well, it's been the run game that he's contributed to the most over the course of this season. So what does this mean for the New Orleans Saints if they can't get their run game established? Well, we saw it up against the Philadelphia Eagles, to where they weren't able to get that run game going, and we saw sort of the costly results of that. Now, we should also mention that a big part of those costly results also came down to the Saints' injuries on the offensive line, things like that. But the Saints are still dealing with some offensive line injuries. Shane Lemieux, who started at center last week, was out of practice on Thursday, which was this week's Wednesday. The Saints are doing a Thursday, Friday, Saturday practice schedule as opposed to a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday practice schedule because of the Monday Night Football game. And so they're still dealing with injuries over on their offensive line. So this means that the Saints are likely going to have to win through the air a little bit in this game if they want to come up with the big shocking upset on Monday Night Football going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. So that means that Chris Olave is going to be big, and he was back to healthy, full participation on the injury report on Thursday. That's great news. He comes back off that hamstring injury, because just last week, Chris Olave went for over 80 receiving yards for the third game in a row while dealing with a hamstring injury. So him being healthy and coming in and going up against what has been a bottom of the league or bottom 10 of the league team when it comes to defending the run. I believe that they're defending the pass. I believe that they're number 22 in terms of passing yards allowed right now. Kansas City is over on defense. That's a pretty good situation for a healthy Chris Olave. And honestly, this could be a big game for Rashid Shaheed as well. One of the reasons why being that the Kansas City Chiefs play a lot of what's called middle of field open defenses, cover 2, cover 4, kind of those even number drop back type players. And the reason why it's called middle of field open is because those types of defensive systems do exactly that. They leave the middle of the field open. So when you think about Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed with their speed and their ability to be able to stretch fields, their ability to be able to get open deep, and especially Rashid Shaheed's effectiveness with the post route deep, sending him downfield into the middle of the field could be a good option for New Orleans and could be something that works out for Derek Carr, for Rashid Shaheed, for Chris Olave to kind of get back to the explosive plays that they were generating early on in the season over the course of the first 2 weeks. So if the Saints are going to want to have any shot at winning this game, those big explosive plays, especially early on in games, are going to be pivotal. The Saints are going to have to get off to a fast start because if you allow Kansas City to either play too close from behind or play with a comfortable lead, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have a bad time. And so that's something that the New Orleans Saints are going to have to make sure that they fight against. The Saints, for the first 4 games, have scored on their opening drives, 3 touchdown drives, 1 field goal. If the Saints can keep that streak alive, which I think would be the longest going back to even before the Super Bowl year, because for the last time that the Saints scored on 4 of their opening drives in the first 4 opening games was in 2009. So this will be the first time for a while that they would move up to 5 straight games, if not the first time ever that they did that in 5 straight games to open the season. So we'll see where things go there. But one of the things that will work in New Orleans' advantage in this situation is that if you want to generate those explosive plays, if you want to be able to attack downfield, if you want to be able to take advantage of the middle of the field in particular, you're going to need to have some time to allow these routes and these concepts to develop, right? So even if the offensive line struggles against the run game or the run defense in terms of the fronts for the Kansas City Chiefs have not been the pressure team that you expect them to be. Number 20 in the NFL when it comes to Kansas City in terms of pressure rate. Basically, they haven't really been able to solidify a pass rushing threat outside of Chris Jones. And here's the thing. Chris Jones is really good. And Chris Jones not only plays on the interior, but he'll play towards the outside. They move him around a lot. Derek Carr yesterday compared him to Micah Parsons, for instance. You can see something similar in terms of Chris Jones, in terms of the way that they move him around over with Kansas City. Now, New Orleans handled Micah Parsons pretty well. They handled that Dallas Cowboys pass rushing front very well, but they also had their entire healthy starting offensive line. So the Saints might be doing a little bit of patchwork work here. Maybe Nick Saldiveri at left guard. Maybe, that would mean Lucas Patrick at center or something like that, depending upon what Shane Lemieux's injury looks like for the long run. So definitely something to watch here. But for New Orleans, if they're able to maybe mitigate the pressure that Chris Jones puts on or limits the pressure that Chris Jones puts on, that might buy them these opportunities to be able to take advantage of the sort of shaky pass defense, bottom 10 in the league pass defense, and that middle of field open sort of coverage that they tend to lean towards, not 100% of the time, but the majority of the time. Then I think that goes pretty well for New Orleans. Kansas City runs those middle of field open defenses within the top 10 in the NFL in terms of rate. So very much something to watch out for there. Now, the Saints over on the defensive side are looking to bounce back and maybe prove themselves a little bit. And this is the perfect scenario and perfect setting to do exactly that. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at PrizePicks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's you versus the house. PrizePicks gives you a set of projections for players that are playing in each game over the course of the weekend, football, basketball, whatever it is that you're looking for. And then you just choose more or less against those projections. You can do that for up to 2 to 6 players. If you get up to 4 of those players right, you can win up to 100 times your entry back over at PrizePicks. Plus, they give you weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts. They'll also give you discounts sometimes on select player promotions or projections rather, to give you, provide even more value to your lineup. So maybe you want to get started early with the London game on Saturday. Justin Jefferson, you think he's going to go more or less than 83.5 passing yards, or rather receiving yards, up against Sauce Gardner? You like Patrick Mahomes in this Saints game to go more or less than 267.5 passing yards? It's that easy. Go and check them out today. Download the app and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for an instant $50 bonus when you play your first $5 lineup. Your first $5 lineup, use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL on the PrizePicks app for $50 instantly. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints defense is looking to kind of prove something, right? A couple of late scoring drives given up that have led to wins, losses for the New Orleans Saints, wins for the opposing team. They're now in a situation where they're looking to prove who they are and prove that they're still the dominant defense that they have been for the past several years. And this is the perfect opportunity to prove itself, that New Orleans Saints defense, on Monday Night Football. It's going to be extremely tough, but that's part of what makes it the perfect opportunity, because if the New Orleans Saints defense can stand up to Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid, Travis Kelce, and that Kansas City Chiefs offense, all of a sudden, they're making a pretty big statement, and they're doing it on a national stage. So this is a big matchup for New Orleans. It's not a must-win with them being an AFC opponent. The loss will be weighted a little bit differently. The NFC South continues to be one that kind of cannibalizes itself. So the Saints are still very much in the running, win or lose. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But I think the New Orleans Saints would rather leave Kansas City with a win than a loss, don't you think? There you go. There's your hashtag analysis today. So look, here's a little bit of why I think the New Orleans Saints are kind of in position to do this. I'm not saying that they're in position to win. I'm saying that they're in position because, or to give themselves the best opportunity to be able to prove something. The Saints defense is getting a little bit healthier. Now, while Willie Gay Jr. looks like he might be out for a little while, posted a photo on social media following his hand injury that made it look like, at least, or it looked like there was some kind of procedure done in that situation. Dennis Allen declining to speak about that on Thursday. But for New Orleans, they did get Demario Davis back to practice. He was limited with his hamstring injury, but he was back at practice and participating. So that's a good sign. I would expect him back this weekend. I've always kind of expected, even when Demario Davis missed last week's game, that he would be ready to go for this game, mostly because, look, Demario Davis is as tough as they get. He is very strong-willed, very strong-minded. He wants to be out there. He wants to play football. You're only going to win that battle with Demario Davis once in terms of him not being able to get back out on the field when he feels like he can be out on the field. So Demario Davis, I expect to be back out there this weekend. And Tyrann Matheiu, New Orleans Saints safety, I also expect to be back out there this weekend as well. Didn't seem limited, dealing with a lot of injuries. Heel, I believe groin for a little while was a thing too. He has just kind of battled through all of that over the course of the start of this season. And he was back out there on Thursday on the practice field, taking reps, running, doing everything. I mean, he was fully participating. So good news for New Orleans to see both Demario Davis and Tyrann Matheiu back. And then the Demario Davis return is kind of compounded in terms of importance because of the loss of Willie Gay for however long that ends up being. So I would expect it to either be Anthony Orji or DeMarco Jackson that comes in for some of those sub packages when they use three linebackers. But that puts the Saints in a pretty good position because they've got the majority of their team healthy. Now, Peyton Turner didn't practice, on Thursday, and he's somebody that has been contributing as an additional pass rusher, but you still have Carl Granderson, you still have Cam Jordan, you still have Chase Young. You're still in a pretty good position there. You got Colin Saunders back last week, so your defensive interior is at full strength. Your linebacking core at least looks like it's going to be ready in terms of its starters, and your secondary is currently at full strength. So a good situation there for New Orleans, unlike last week where they didn't have Demario Davis, which of course is going to take a toll, and then they didn't have Tyrann Matheiu for a latter portion of the game as well. So pretty good news for New Orleans to get those players back because that's your heartbeat on your defense. And when you're going up against Patrick Mahomes, you kind of want Demario Davis and Tyrann Matheiu on the field, don't you think? And I'm sure Tyrann Matheiu is looking forward to kind of going up against Kansas City in this situation as well. So the Saints defense hasn't been as strong as usual when it comes to the run defense in regards to yardage, but they have been limiting, or really not even just run defense, really as a whole, right? Like their defensive standing in terms of yardage is lower than you would typically anticipate. However, they've done a very good job of limiting scoring. They've only allowed 4 touchdowns so far this season, which is least in the NFL. The issue for them has been when they've allowed or scored touchdowns for the other team, especially up against Atlanta. But in those situations or throughout this season, New Orleans has been pretty stout when it comes to all of that. I think that they would need to be able to keep that going here against Kansas City. But again, they're going to be tested. They're going to be tested with how much Kansas City is going to want to lean on Travis Kelce, who really came to life last week after the team lost wide receiver Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice was doing a really good job of picking up yards after catch, kind of fighting through all that contact, doing all those other things, but now has gone down with that knee injury. He's on injured reserve. We'll miss at least the next 4 weeks, but we'll see what it ends up actually looking like for Rice. But that's a Kansas City Chiefs fans problem for you. You're going to be focused on Travis Kelce in this one. And I would expect the New Orleans Saints to double team the ever-loving whatever out of Travis Kelce in this game. You'll take your guys up against rookie wide receiver Xavier Worthy and Juju Smith-Schuster, the veteran. You're going to take those matchups. But you've got to make sure you're trying to limit Travis Kelce as much as possible. And I'll tell you right now, it's only going to go so far, right? You're only going to be able to limit him so much. He's going to get his more than likely. But we'll see. I mean, New Orleans did a really, really good job up against Kyle Pitts last week, even after surrendering a ton of yardage to Dallas Goedert, the Philadelphia Eagles tight end. So we'll see how things go in terms of the way that they defend him. But that's going to be a big thing. The other thing is going to be that their in-game situations will likely be tested as well. I'm working on a piece right now around sort of the anatomy of a game-winning drive or a late scoring drive and what that means for a team, how you prepare, how you execute, but on both sides of the football. New Orleans defense struggled to execute mightily up against the Philadelphia Eagles in those situations, running into one another, allowing that big Dallas Goedert catch and run, all that. But then against the Atlanta Falcons, it wasn't that the defense performed poorly. They only gave up a certain, I think it was 5 yards in that final drive, but it was the discipline on the pass interference penalty that ended up putting Atlanta in position for what has been a spectacular 2 weeks for Atlanta in terms of those late comebacks, or not necessarily comebacks, but those game-winning drives and things like that they've done, those last-second wins. That's the phrase that I'm looking for. So if New Orleans ends up in that situation again, and Patrick Mahomes is on the other side of the football, the in-game situation is going to be tested mightily for New Orleans. So that's one of the reasons why I said earlier, getting off to a fast start is really the best thing that New Orleans can do to give themselves a best chance in this situation, is to be up multiple scores going late into the game, but that is going to be easier said than done. The New Orleans Saints have surrendered the most yards per carry so far in the NFL versus the zone run. The good news, though, is that Kansas City runs a lot of gap scheme and man run concepts. Number 7 in the NFL as we speak, in regards to the number of man run runs that they have done. The Saints have been the 4th best team against that specific scheme of the run game. So unlike New Orleans, who has run the most in terms of getting outside the tackles, outside zone run, getting your offensive line moving off the football, things like that, Kansas City kind of plays the smash mouth, straight ahead, downhill type blocking. And New Orleans actually fared very well against that. Again, number 4 in the NFL when it comes to that. They also haven't faced it a ton, but still number 4, they've been pretty efficient in a yards per carry. So this is on a per carry basis here type of situation there. So not bad when it comes to that, but New Orleans is definitely going to have to hold on to that. And then finally, I think that tackling is going to be a vital situation for New Orleans as well. Over 68% of Patrick Mahomes' yardage so far, passing yardage so far this season, has been gained after the catch by his pass catchers. So tackling at the catch point has got to be a big time focus for the New Orleans Saints. We saw that in the first half of the last couple of games, but in the second half, the Saints defense is kind of falling apart in that category. So you want to make sure that you're being able to play all 60 minutes in that category, not allowing Travis Kelce, Xavier Worthy, Juju Smith-Schuster, and others to be able to pick up those yards after catch. Patrick Mahomes has operated very close to the line of scrimmage so far this season. Keep it that way if you're New Orleans. We're going to do our game plan episode on Monday, and we'll discuss a ton more about this. But Kansas City has not been the explosive team. New Orleans has been the team that has been giving up a lot of explosive plays. Not a great match for New Orleans, but there's a way to mitigate it and to kind of make that all better. We'll break that down on Monday's episode. Coming up next, though, we're going to take a look at the NFC South. because it's in reach with a win or a loss. Jermaine Jackson back with the New Orleans Saints, which actually is something that's been in the works for a while, and why kicker could play a huge role in this game against Kansas City. We got all that coming up for you as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at FanDuel. New Orleans still traveling to Kansas City as 5.5-point underdogs. If you like the New Orleans Saints to cover that, FanDuel is the place to go. You like them to upset all together. There's some good odds over on the money line that you can check out as well. The New Orleans Saints plus 215 when it comes to the money line. So maybe that's a place you want to get in on, or much more. You can find a ton of stuff over at FanDuel today. I'm a big fan of a couple of the prop bets that are going on around the NFL right now as well. Justin Jefferson, going up against that New York Jets offense, all that. Anytime touchdown for Stephon Diggs feels like a really good one in his revenge game against Buffalo this weekend with Houston. A ton for you to check out over at FanDuel to make sure you're opening up this season with a big return. And if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats and play-by-play all in the same window as where you place your bets. And if you're a first-time customer, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's $200 guaranteed for new customers placing their first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The NFC South just can't seem to get out of its own way, and that actually ends up being good news for the New Orleans Saints, win or loss on Monday night in Kansas City. The Saints are in a good position here if they can get things turned around. So I want to emphasize here that when I talk about the New Orleans Saints being in a good position, what I mean is the environment around them is conducive, right? The environment around them is not overwhelmingly strong, right? So within the division, the Atlanta Falcons knocking off the Green Bay Packers, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on Thursday Night Football last night actually works out really well for New Orleans because that kept Tampa from going to 4-1 and extending their lead within the division. Now the separation between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Atlanta Falcons, and the New Orleans Saints is that the New Orleans Saints are one game behind in each of those behind each of those teams. The issue being that the Atlanta Falcons now have a head-to-head win over New Orleans, but the Saints will get an opportunity to tie that up week 10. And they get an opportunity with Tampa Bay coming to town next week to maybe get an early jump on their division matchup as well. So a lot of stuff works in the New Orleans Saints' favor based on the Atlanta Falcons knocking off the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Atlanta in dramatic fashion last night. The 1 second spike, Younghoe Koo kick, all those things. The thing that the one thing that did drive me crazy was Younghoe Koo missing from within 40 yards or within 50 yards twice on two different occasions, and you're just kind of going, okay, well, now you missed the kick, of course. If you're a Saints fan watching that one. So look, if the Saints can surprise against Kansas City, of course, they're in a much better situation. But I'll tell you this too, if the Saints lose in Kansas City, as many will pick them to do, and understandably so, you're going up against the back-to-back Super Bowl champions, you're coming off a 2-game losing streak after a super hot start. Like, I get it, I understand. But if New Orleans were to lose that game, that puts them in a 2-3 record, which still is only one game behind that 3-2 record with Tampa coming to town. Now, unfortunately for New Orleans, Atlanta is heading to Carolina, but maybe you get a little bit of Andy Dalton magic at home in Carolina, and then you get an opportunity to maybe even tie things up at 3-3 across the league, or at least tie for second place at 3-3, or really earn sole second place if you can beat Tampa next week. So even if you exit this game with a loss, 2-3, if you're the New Orleans Saints, beating Tampa next week still earns you second place within the division. So that's a really, really good spot for New Orleans to be in. And then you're just hoping that you're going to be able to carry things forward as your schedule gets much weaker moving ahead. You get the Thursday Night Football matchup. It's a bit advantageous up against the Denver Broncos, whose offense has struggled. Now that Denver defense has been really good, so we'll see where things go. But the Saints also get all of their kind of inconvenient games out of the way. They're coming off of the Monday night game, going into the Sunday game against Tampa, which is going to be a short week. And then you get another short week going into that Thursday Night Football game. But then you're kind of smooth sailing after that in terms of what the rest of your weeks look like outside of one Monday Night Football game in December up against the Green Bay Packers. And then you come on a short week right after that. But you're on a short week coming back at home. So there's some advantageous things there. So just some stuff to keep an eye out on with looking at the rest of the NFC South and kind of where things stand The Saints aren't out of this one yet. They would be in much better position had they been able to win one of those two games that was very winnable for them against Philly and Atlanta. But as Jim Mora would say, shoulda, coulda, woulda. Jermaine Jackson was brought back to the practice squad. Jacob Kibodi, the Louisiana-born player whose dream it was to play for the New Orleans Saints, unfortunately has his contract terminated to make that spot available. This has a little bit of a ripple effect, and this gets us back to a little bit of where things stand for the New Orleans Saints this week from an injury perspective. Kendre Miller is back. Kendre Miller came back to practice on Thursday, participated a little bit, wasn't super involved, but this is a lot like what we talked about. It feels unlikely that Kendre Miller is going to be good to go Monday night up against the Kansas City Chiefs, nor does he need to be. The Saints can spend up to 3 weeks getting Kendre Miller back into football shape, getting his conditioning ready, making sure that he understands the playbook, all these other things. And I think that that's really a value for New Orleans. They'll be able to still roll ahead with Jamal Williams and Jordan Mims behind Alvin Kamara. So they have their 3 running backs there. Kendre Miller doesn't count against the active roster yet. He's just had his practice window open. So the Saints have a maximum of 3 weeks to get things figured out there. Do they want to roster him and add him to the active roster? Or do they feel like things aren't going to pan out? Throw him back on injured reserve and into season. That's another route that they could go as well. Now, here's the tricky part with Kendre Miller is that he's effectively been absent for 70 plus days when it comes to practice. He practiced that very first day of training camp, got into individual drills, and then had that hamstring injury. And since that hamstring injury, the first day of training camp, he has not practiced up until Thursday. And Thursday, again, was very light. So the Saints will probably take their time around Kendre Miller, see how things go with him and all that. They don't need to rush. So because they get Kendre Miller back, however, they were able to move on from Jacob Kibodi. You get a runner back, you move on from a runner. That gives you an opportunity then to be able to add somebody to your practice squad. And the Saints quickly added wide receiver and return specialist, the undrafted free agent out of Idaho, Jermaine Jackson, back to the team on the practice squad. Jermaine Jackson was with the New Orleans Saints throughout training camp, dealt with, I'll call it an undisclosed injury because we're not super sure exactly what it was, but that ended up landing him on injured reserve. And then they ended up coming to an injury waiver or an injury settlement that sent Jermaine Jackson out to free agency. The Saints had to wait a certain amount of time before they could bring him back. And they effectively made that deal as they moved on from Jermaine Jackson. I asked Dennis Allen about this yesterday, and he told us that the idea with Jermaine Jackson all along was that they wanted him back on the practice squad. And so when they had to move on with him because of that injury during training camp, they basically said, hey, go rehab, get yourself taken care of. When you're good, we want to bring you back. And the New Orleans Saints made good on that promise as soon as they could. This was the opportunity that presented. Kendre Miller coming back to the roster allowed them to be able to open up a spot on their practice squad, and then Jermaine Jackson gets added. So do I think that Jermaine Jackson has some kind of a big role for New Orleans in store? Not without injury ahead of him, but he gives them an inside slot option. He gives them return flexibility as well. So it gives you an opportunity there. So interesting how much the New Orleans Saints really wanted to get Jermaine Jackson back to the roster, but cool to see it all happen. Finally, New Orleans Saints kicker Blake Grupe missed practice on Thursday with a right hip injury. In his place, undrafted free agent rookie, international program player, from Ireland, Charlie Smith, ended up taking the kicks in practice. And so this could be a big week for the New Orleans Saints because they might have to turn away from their starting kicker in Blake Grupe and then elevate Charlie Smith to have a kicker this week. Now, the good news is that the NFL changed its rules around international player exemptions. It used to be that they basically sit on your practice squad for the entire year. You can't elevate them. That has now changed. The Saints can elevate Charlie Smith just like they could any other practice squad member up to 3 times on the season before they have to make a decision to put him on the roster or move on or send him through waivers. And so the Saints could do that. So they could turn to Charlie Smith if they needed to. But here's the thing with Blake Grupe. He's been excellent throughout his career in outdoor games. 8 of 9 on his field goal attempts in outdoor games, and then 10 of 10 in terms of extra points. Charlie Smith is coming in with 1 professional kick under his belt, and it was a doozy, the 37-yard field goal that won the game winner up against the Arizona Cardinals in the first preseason game. So not to discount that at all, but it would be a pretty big deal to lose Blake Grupe, who has been solid in these outdoor kicks. Basically, the only one that he's missed throughout his career is that big one in the potential game winner in Green Bay that was from 61, right? 60 plus yards out. So it could have a big impact on New Orleans to not have Blake Grupe, but it could have a big impact on New Orleans to see Charlie Smith too. So this could really go either way for New Orleans. So kicker becomes a big storyline this week, and of course will play a big role in this matchup up against the Kansas City Chiefs, which we'll break down more on Monday with our game plan episode. We'll go into 5 things you need to know as well this weekend. But as of now, that'll wrap us up for today. It's the air game in this one that I have not question marks, but I'm interested in seeing how it impacts the game for New Orleans on the offensive side, their ability to be able to match up with Kansas City, particularly in in-game situation on the defensive side. And hey, look, the Saints are still alive in the NFC South. If they can steal a victory and shock the world, it puts them in great position with Tampa Bay coming to town next week. So we appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On NFL for more NFL chat. Myself and Tyler Rowland breaking down our FanDuel Friday. Go and check out some of our favorite bets of the week over at Locked On NFL. We appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.